The views and opinions expressed in these podcasts are those of the speakers and do not necessarily represent the views or positions of the Department of Modern Languages and Cultures or Baylor University. Welcome to episode 4 of In Other Worlds, a podcast series presented by the Department of Modern Languages and Cultures at Baylor University. In this series, we will introduce you to research conducted by members of our faculty, some of our programs, and highlight student experiences. Our guest today is Dr. Andrew Wisely. Dr. Wisely is professor of German in the Department of Modern Languages and Cultures. Thank you for agreeing to be our guest today.
Certainly.
Dr. Wisely. Dr. Wisely is here to have a conversation with us about his new book titled The Trial of a Nazi Doctor, Franz Lucas as Defendant, Opportunist, and Deceiver, published by Bergon Books in 2024. Dr. Wisely, give us a little history about how you were drawn to this project on Franz Lucas.
Sure. Well, a long time ago, sometime around 2006, I was reading the writings of the political philosopher Hannah Arendt, and she was writing about the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial, which had happened from 1963 to 65. And she noticed that one of the defendants, Franz Lucas, didn't act as terribly as the other defendants in the courtroom. He didn't insult the witnesses. He didn't make fun of the whole process. He was pretty taciturn. He really didn't want to be there. And in fact, one of the witnesses who spoke out in favor of Lucas said he doesn't belong in this courtroom at all. So I took that as a cue to investigate this person, and I found out that he really did have a dark side that Hannah Arendt didn't recognize.
Okay, great. In case people are not familiar, and I would imagine there are many who may not be familiar, can you give us just a brief bio of Lucas? The highlights, his background,
Sure.
His education, etc.
So Lucas was born in 1911. He finished his prep school training and entered university in Münster in northwest Germany in 1933, the year the Nazis took power. And so he had medical lectures. He finished part of his exams in Münster. Then he moved to Rostock right by the Baltic Sea and continued his medical education, took his medical exams, passed all of them. And then he moved from there to Danzig or Gdansk, also on the Baltic in Poland. And he wrote a dissertation on ectopic pregnancy. So he was in training to be a gynecologist. And that's pretty much his university training.
Okay.
Did you want to know the SS and
if you can.
So the organizations, the SS, the Nazi Party, the SA, the stormtroopers. Lucas joined the SS in 1937 in Rostock, and he also applied for the Nazi Party at the same time. And so it was his way of saying, I didn't want to stay on the sidelines any longer. I wanted to be involved just for career advantages. And basically he said his friend talked him into joining the SS.
Okay.
We know that to be probably a lie.
Right. Before we get into more details about Lucas and the book, can you tell us where you gathered your materials, which archives, and what types of materials that you use to weave your narrative?
Sure. In the United States, actually, I started here with the National Archives and Records Association in College Park, Maryland. And I got access to SS files which had not been destroyed by the Nazis before they fled the camps. And I also then researched at the U.S. Holocaust Museum right next door to College Park, so in D.C. And I realized that I've physically was in archives in Germany in 10 different cities. And then those are mostly military, court, church, newspaper, local, regional, state archives, mostly in Berlin and in Koblenz, where the federal archives were, but also in his hometown of Elmshorn, north of Hamburg. And so those were the most places I went physically. And then I wrote to places in the Netherlands, in Norway, in Poland, in Austria, to get records from the camps the concentration camps where Lukas served.
Okay, great. Well, it shows in your work the depth of your research and the breadth of it as well. Lots of sources. It's quite amazing. Can you tell us what were Lucas's work assignments after he was in the SS, after he completed his medical degrees? Which camps, for example?
Sure. He started out at the worst place at the end of 1943. In mid-December, he was assigned to Auschwitz-Birkenau, and then he served there almost 8 months. From there, he went to Mauthausen in Austria, and then to Stutthof, which is very close to Gdansk, where he was writing his dissertation. And from Stutthof, he went to Ravensbrück, mostly a camp for women. And from there, at the end of February 1945, his last camp till mid-April was Sachsenhausen, which was also pretty close to Berlin and very close to Ravensbrück.
See.
And so he went from there. He deserted the SS in mid-April and made his way back to the Hamburg area.
I see. So Lucas was a defendant in the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial. So could you describe for us exactly what he's accused of in terms of the trial?
Yes, the main accusation against Lukas, even though he was considered one of the less evil defendants, was that on 4 separate occasions, and this was a conservative estimate, at least 4 times he was one of the selecting doctors on the arrival ramp at Birkenau. And so this meant that he selected the arriving Jewish deportees, and he pointed them to the line either for the gas chamber or to the line for labor in the camp, which was also sort of a death by degrees, being worked to death for the most part. And so the charge was that on those occasions, the conservative estimate was that each time he was responsible for 1,000 deaths. So altogether, 4,000 deaths, although we know it must have been much higher than that.
Higher, right. And the 2 different lines in the camps, one, if you were considered too weak or
That's right.
ill.
Under a certain age or over a certain age, and if you were a child or if you were a mother with children, usually you didn't have a chance.
Okay. And ostensibly, the other people who were not sent immediately to gas chambers would be in forced labor.
That's right. Yeah. And at this time, it was 1944, so it was also very close to the time when he was assigned to work with the so-called Höchstaktion, or the action that saw the extermination of most of the Hungarian Jews who had been sent, about 330,000 in the spring of 1944, and he was there for most of that.
Okay. In the German courts and review of defendants' cases, they use some terms. One is perpetrator and one is accomplice. Can you tell us what that distinction means?
Yeah. So the perpetrator is usually the one recognized having a position of responsibility, the ability to make decisions that affect a lot of lives. And usually this person has the smoking gun, right? This is mostly the people who were tried in Nuremberg right after the war. Their names were on all the documents, that sort of thing. And if it's not someone in responsibility, the perpetrator is also someone who is in a lesser position, who shows excessive zeal or initiative in committing murder. And so it could be that this is just someone who shows how much he or she enjoyed the killing process. And so the accomplice is then the one who always argued that he was in a position where he just had to follow orders, and it was always under duress. And usually, at least for a while, that argument held weight because there was no way to prove whether the person really was in duress or not. Although the Allies discouraged that, but the German courts sort of automatically picked up that argument and found ways, even though they got the facts of the cases right, they found ways during the sentencing to mitigate the punishment so that these people, Lucas himself, responsible for 4,000 lives, ends up being sentenced to 3 years and 3 months. So less than
that, right?
An armed robbery.
And we've talked about the Auschwitz trial. Could you give us an overview, or the number of defendants, length of the trial, etc.?
So it started December 20th, 1963. The day of sentencing was August 20 of 1965, exactly 20 months, and 20 defendants by the time all was said and done. 3 of those defendants were exonerated. 6 were sentenced to life. And the rest and so they were considered perpetrators. The rest were considered accessories or accomplices, and they got anywhere from 3 years, 3 months, which was Lucas, to 14 years. And almost all of them didn't have to serve the entire time. So this is a reflection of society at the time.
Right. What type of defense did Lucas use? What was his main argument?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because it did change. He was able to deny the charge against him successfully for more than a year. And then he was caught in his denial and forced to confess. And after that, he said the only reason he was doing the selection on the ramps was because he was forced to by the evil commandant, Josef Kramer, whose name was famous for being the commandant of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp when it was liberated by the British and had 60,000 prisoners and probably 10,000 dead prisoners by the time it was liberated. And so he was able to shift the blame onto a recognized bad guy.
Right. I see.
And the other thing about that is that every time that he was transferred to a different camp, he explained it by saying that he had committed some act of resistance, and that was his way of being punished.
Punishment for resisting. Yes.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. In the course of your examination of documents, and I know you've spoken to people in person also, was there one big reveal for you or one thing that really surprised you or something that you did not expect to discover?
Yeah, let me just say 2 things. The first thing was when I discovered at a military archive in Berlin that there were actually the physical remnants of documents that had not been destroyed, and it was a telegram exchange between Lucas and his commandant at Auschwitz at the time. Lucas had gotten a furlough to go back to Osnabrück because his family house had been bombed by the Allies. And this is right at the start of the Hungarian campaign, in other words, against the Hungarian Jews at Auschwitz. And he actually got permission to stay a little bit longer at home, but his commandant said, "Your work is needed here, so please get back as soon as you can," which is just another proof that he probably selected more than 4 times.
4 times.
But he was in the regular cycle of things. Then the second thing was I was really surprised by the number of character references that he was able to get from a lot of his patients, current and former gynecology patients in the Elmshorn City Hospital. His lawyer found out that Lucas's wife and Rudolf Aschenauer, the lawyer, they could actually assemble a lot of documents attesting to Lucas's good doctoring skills and, the fact that he would never have done anything bad in the past based on his character now. And so they assembled these in an attempt to shorten his sentence. So this would have been like in 1966, 67. Fortunately, it didn't work. The people in charge of lightening the sentence or, pronouncing amnesty were not fazed by this collection of dozens of letters saying, we don't know what he was like then, but he could not have done a harmful thing based on what we know about him now.
Tell us, Lucas was exonerated in 1970 in a review of his case. How did he live out the rest of his days? What was he occupied with?
So he was already busy making sure he had his road paved back to practicing medicine. So it happened that the medical authorities really, they didn't shun him or punish him in a way that you would think that a medical board would punish former Nazi doctors. So he was able to go back to practicing medicine, partly private and partly city hospital, where he was the director of the gynecology division. And so he practiced another 13 or 14 years, and then he was in retirement for another 10 before he passed away.
And he passed away in 1994.
94, yes.
Okay. Tell us what your next project is. I know it has a connection to this
Sure.
project.
Yeah, the next project is actually it's more interesting to me because it's not taking so much time to figure out whether this person is telling the truth or not. And it's a biography, it's sort of a career analysis of a Mannheim prosecutor named Barbara Just Dahlmann. And this is a woman who was very instrumental in the 1960s in Germany to make sure that the Nazi criminals on trial, 20 years, 25 years after the fact of their crimes, were not being classified. Well, the problem was they were being classified as accomplices, and she was doing her best to make sure that they were reclassified as perpetrators. That was a hard road to travel for her. But she dedicated the rest of her career from 1960 onward to making sure that victims and their families felt a little bit more the force of justice. And she herself spoke Polish, and she grew up as an ethnic German in Poland, and so she was able to translate Jewish Polish diaries and letters and things like that into German, and it affected the way she thought as a German for the rest of her life.
Very interesting. Do you have a forecast of when that might appear? I know that's iffy.
Yeah, as an academic, there's less time to spend on it during the semester, but I have made good headway on it, and I hope maybe by the end of the summer, it will be sent out for vetting and reviewing.
Sure, great. So we have not discussed everything about the book, Trial of a Nazi Doctor, so I hope you will find the book, acquire it, and read it. There are many, many more fascinating details, philosophical arguments about the distinctions between perpetrator and accomplice, and looking into the research of how memory works either for us or fails in some accounts, related to a tragic event in the history of mankind. So our time is up. So I hope you will join us again next month when we will have episode 5. And I would like to thank once more Dr. Andrew Wisely for taking the time to discuss his project with us.